Hello, and welcome to the review for week 3, heading into week 4. Just to let you know, this last week, a few people have emailed in reference to the peer responses, mostly to say that they've been a little bit disappointed with their score, which I can understand. Just to let you know, what we're really looking for in those responses to your peer, I sent a couple emails with this in it, is a very developed paragraph. It doesn't have to be super long, but it does need to be a bit more robust than just I agree with this, I like this, etc. What I'm really looking for is that you take a point from their posting and that you use that as your main idea. I agree with your point that Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper is a story of feminism and also postpartum depression, and that it reflects the time period. So you have your observation. Then you have evidence, and this evidence comes from the book. It can come from the discussion postings. It could come from the notes from your other peers. It can basically be anything, but it's evidence that supports that main idea. And then, of course, there is your analysis. That's the next portion of the paragraph. Your analysis is where you tell your reader how that evidence connects, explains, demonstrates, explores, etc., your main idea. And then, of course, a link back either to the discussion or possibly a link back to another idea or even a conclusion of sorts. And you want to make it a robust and form a type of response back. So please feel free to keep in contact with me, email me. I'm happy to take a look at these postings before you put them up and let you know how you're doing. Now, as far as things go for this discussion, we did speak about naturalism. And naturalism is slightly different than realism. And one of the main ways that many of you mentioned it, in fact, Raymond had a good observation when he said that naturalism explains the bold truth, no matter the severity, which is a great observation. Another good observation that was mentioned about naturalism was Gwendolyn's idea that naturalism demonstrates a degrading behavior and the survival in the face of that. Jeffrey also mentioned that naturalism deals with the importance of life and elements of the environment, so that naturalism really does reflect what's going on in the environment and the effects on that character, the effects on the setting, etc. Jerry really succinctly put it in a great form by saying that it's the environment and social conditions affecting human behavior. So that is a great way to think about it, to think about the environment and social conditions affecting human behavior and capturing this within the story. We also had April, who mentioned that naturalism shows life at its full rawness, which is a great way to think about it. And we also had Althea, who mentioned that naturalism shows the uterus that affects the woman, in particular in the Yellow Wallpaper, and that the controlling force is society and the surrounding environment. Rachel captured naturalism by saying that it was amazing to see the effect a person's environment and or society as a whole can have on their thought process, so capturing that. Angela focused on the idea of the unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem? That tension in the naturalistic writers. Justin captured the idea that naturalism illustrates the obstacles that people face or that individuals face within their environment. We also had in Prinzetia mentioned that all works are great representations of this naturalism and in capturing the struggle. We also have Monica, who presented the idea that these works explore the dark harshness of life, and that nature is harsh, therefore naturalism captures that. Joseph mentioned that these works and naturalism show the struggles of the less fortunate, which is a good point because naturalism does deal with the lower classes usually. Kimberly mentioned that the power of the stories was to evoke an empathy, to make an empathetic feeling, to have a catharsis of sorts. Joshua said that the struggle is really central to naturalism, and that is true. Chastity mentioned that this was the power of reality being forecast or put forward. And Jeremy mentioned that not everyone makes it through their own storm, and using the open boat by Crane as to kind of capture this. And then Michael, a good point to kind of end up before we start talking is that sometimes you have to go through a little bit of hell to get to heaven. This idea that there is a better place waiting for you. Naturalism is a term, a literary term. It is a movement. We have realism, and then we go to naturalism, late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's basically an application of principles from the scientific community. It draws its name from the basic assumption that everything exists in nature, conceived as a world of objects, actions, and forces that yield their secrets to objective scientific inquiry. This naturalistic view of the human being, of the society, and the environment is that animals in the natural world, they respond to the environmental stresses, the internal fears, forces, and that we don't really have control or the ability to understand them, much like the animals. It tends to differ from realism, and one of the main points that differs is that it selects not the commonplace, but the representative, and arranges the work so that it structures, reveals the patterns of ideas, this kind of scientific theory. Naturalism is a response to the revolution in thought that science has produced. You have a little bit of Darwin, of course, popping up in there, the idea of Marx, the idea of Freud, of course. We have a variety of different kind of minor schools of naturalism, such as Impressionism and Expressionism. Naturalistic works tend to emphasize either a biological or a socioeconomic determinism. Human beings are often seen as the victims of destiny and or fate. But whichever view, fate or destiny is taken, the naturalist strives to be objective in the presentation of materials, tries not to give you a value judgment on a character's choices or a character of him or herself. This period really ran rampant between 1900 and 1930, and it was it had peaks and valleys during this time period. Of course, there's some other ideas that kind of start popping up, and you can see them in modern American poetry. But we do have this sense of symbolism that is also appearing here. Nature is external in many of these areas, so I do think that naturalism really can be boiled down to destiny and fate, and the character being locked in this kind of almost scientific, predetermined existence, and the effect that this environment has on it without the value judgment. Now, many of you really focused on a couple of the works. In fact, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper and Why I Wrote The Yellow Wallpaper really popped up in many of your writings. The Yellow Wallpaper, of course, is one of the earliest examples of a very naturalistic presentation of a woman's madness. It shows us this woman who's caught maturely, physically, and financially in a very comfortable but lethal environment. Edna struggles for some kind of she's like Edna from Chopin's work. She struggles for some kind of self-discovery, affirmation in a context. This notion of this dramatic change, the kind of middle-class cage that she's trapped in. Lauren mentioned that by looking at Gilman's biography, she showed this idea of Gilman capturing parts of her own life, but at the same time capturing this degrading behavior she was stuck in. Charles mentioned that this story was a great example of how the environment contribute to how one turned out or how one's experience was, which is an element of naturalism. Michelle mentioned that why I wrote the yellow wallpaper, which was behind the story, the yellow wallpaper, really did help to provide insight into the story that Gilman captured. Christopher also mentioned the idea of recovery, this kind of overview or awareness that one achieves at the end of the story. And then, of course, Naya and others mentioned this idea of feminism, the lack of rights in the yellow wallpaper. We also had Carmen and Deborah both saw this feminist and socialist and naturalist writer. Deborah mentioned this sense of frustration and despair that really does appear in Gilman's work. We also saw in, Lacey mentioned that in the yellow wallpaper, it really captured the time period's attitudes towards a woman's physical and mental health, which is very true. Corin had some great quotes, a little more analysis for that a very strong posting. Joseph mentioned that the yellow wallpaper was an excellent piece of writing, and it has been lauded in many circles as being a very strong example of writing. We had a number of other people that evoked these. I think the big thing to remember with the yellow wallpaper is that the yellow wallpaper really is about moral indignation. And it has this strain of making you feel frustrated or making you feel like you were in that room with those figures in that wallpaper. And it does have a sense of the supernatural. Many people did evoke that in their writing. Now, I saw a number of you that wrote about Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, which is a novella, so it's a slightly longer short story, but not quite a novel. Crane represents a special power of the mode of naturalism. He really does explain everything that matters about human nature and destiny. He names and describes the hereditary and environmental circumstances of each of the characters. He really does understand social Darwinism, and he even has a sense of, this ironic. That's the other part of naturalism that is often missed, is that there's a sense of irony underlying all of these stories. And this kind of hints at that sense of the supernatural. There's also a sense of the diminishing belief in the possibilities of the human spirit, that we, much like an animal, are kind of constrained by our experiences as a being, not as a soul. And there's some other kind of sense of this protagonist being inherently incapable of achieving something or of accomplishing something. And a lot of you did mention a sense of detachment from the goal or from achieving. Reynaldo mentioned that sense of detachment, connecting it to naturalism, which was key. We also had Adrian mention that instinct, that kind of natural impulse, kept them alive in the boat. We had also Brandy mentioned the richness of it. Vera and Michelle both mentioned this real-life test of friendship fear that was inherent in there. And once again, that Jeremy mentioned that not everyone made it through the storm. So you can see that those are some aspects that, of course, pop in there. Now, we did also have a reading of African American Lit, which in naturalism is a key component, much like it was with realism and local color realism, in that it does capture the environment and the effect of the environment on that individual. And we have the two powerhouses, Washington and Du Bois. And both of those figures kind of operate as the poles for African American literature from the late 1800s to the 1930s and into the Harlem Renaissance. Much like Gilman operates as a feminist voice and Crane operates as a scientific or masculine voice, we have Washington and Du Bois speaking about these ideas of race and of the environment's effect on one's existence. The materials that we read from these two also give us a real opportunity to talk about the construction of the American identity. of an autobiography and also of a text that talks about other important moments during this period. There's a lot of historical and literary awareness in these texts. There is a sense of success and of failure and of fear. I think that it's important to realize, as many of you have mentioned, that these stories capture a true sense of the environment, not just being a force, but of being something that needs to be addressed and engaged as one moves to awareness. Hattie mentioned this idea of the veil that is in Dubois' work, this idea that it shades the view of the world. Charles mentioned that historical element with the Atlanta Compromise. And then, of course, we had within there, like, Betty's idea that there was, this idea that it was kind of a shock to see that the environment that Washington was reacting against and also from, was one of slavery. And then, of course, we had the idea of the lack of rights, the asked questions, these obstacles that are coming forth, and the idea of the less fortunate, and then, of course, of overcoming, of becoming. So I can see a lot of richness in your posts. And I think that that's where we kind of are now in the class, is that you're beginning to see that literature doesn't exist on the pages of a book, that it really does exist in the history and the pop culture and the ideas surrounding the environment that we call our home. In this day and age, almost everything that we touch, engage with our minds, and also in our classroom settings does refer to the history that came before it and builds up on this kind of interreferentiality, this textuality that creates this richness. And you're starting to really encounter those building blocks of American literature and American history and social thoughts. As we move forward into the next week, be aware that on week 6, starting February 15th through the 22nd, we will be having the midterm. The midterm is a series of short answers where you'll be asked a prompt and you'll be asked to respond to that prompt in a paragraph or two. A lot of your discussion postings are very similar to what you could be experiencing in and on the final. So I ask you to be very cognizant as you continue week 4, 5, and 6 that you are thinking about, how do I prepare myself for this midterm? And it is proctored. If you do have any questions or concerns as you are getting closer to the midterm, I'm always happy to answer those. And I look forward to reading your next week's discussion postings. If you do have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to contact me. Thanks, and have a great week.